So this is going to be an intermediate English video podcast, whatever you want to call it, about how to stop translating and start thinking in English. So when we look at core ideas behind natural language acquisition, mental translation, and learning to think directly in a second language, the process kind of can be broken down into 20 practical ideas. So we're going to go through these and talk about them. So phase one is understanding the mental bottleneck, right? Mental translation uses too much working memory. Your brain has to process what it means, convert it into your native tongue, then understand it, then reconvert it back into the language that you're trying to speak. That's too slow and too much energy. So when you translate word for word, your brain has to process two languages at the same time. You hear an English sentence, you convert it to native language, try to understand its meaning. This creates extra mental work, makes listening and speaking much slower. And as you know, a native is going to be ba, 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 just continually talking. And you're still trying to translate a word that was said 2 minutes ago, right? So the goal is to kind of create a direct connection, right? English to the meaning, right? The meaning exists outside of language. It is something that we use language to translate, like to send the meaning to someone else. But the meaning exists outside of the language. Every language has different sounds, words to touch these meanings, right? But the meanings exist across languages. So instead of having English to your native language to then your meaning, you want to remove the native language and just English to the meaning, right? I feel the same way, so te voy a mostrar algo en español. Siento igual como en español. Cuando hablo español es como parte de mi alma, como lo puedo mostrar en cualquier momento. And it's like when I hear Spanish now, it's no longer through English, right? It's part of like my soul. It's like embedded into my brain. I may forget words that I can recall when I need to speak in the moment, but when someone else says it, I can't not understand it anymore, right? I hear it and I know what it means. So that means I'm no longer translating to English. So second point. So this is first point. Second point. Translation can become a safety blanket. So mental translation is not always just a language habit. Sometimes it's an emotional habit. When you're unsure about what someone said, your brain may automatically translate the sentence because it wants to confirm that your interpretation is correct. It gives you a feeling of safety. So you need to be comfortable kind of in the gray zone, right? Just kind of existing, trying to absorb the language for what it is and being comfortable with just not understanding sometimes. So don't fall into that safety mechanism. You can prevent yourself from becoming, the problem is that you're relying on a safety mechanism, which can prevent you from becoming comfortable processing English directly. So try to keep that part of you down, repress it, because over time, English will come up and become the core way you think. Number three, words rarely translate perfectly, right? Like, por un ejemplo en español es cuando alguien me cae bien. If you were to translate that, because the first time someone said that to me, I was like, they fall on you well? Like, yeah, because caer is to fall. So it's like a common mistake is thinking every English word has an equivalent one-to-one translation in your language. You need to kind of think about languages as each thing is its own, right? Like with reflexive verbs in Spanish, like el me cae bien, like the me part, like those types of weird things we don't have in English. I don't try to think about them through English, right? I try to think about Spanish as just this is it's its own entity, right? It has its own rules and ways of doing things. And trying to understand it through English is the wrong way to think about it. You just have to think about it as its own thing, right? Separate but equal. One English word may have several meanings depending on the situation, tone, or context. So languages don't really work on a one-to-one translation. Expressions also carry cultural meanings that may disappear when you translate them literally. This is why, like, learning English only through direct translation can sometimes create misunderstandings. Because what are really languages for, right? They're for taking ideas from here or things that happen in your world encapsulating them into sound and sending them to another person so they can then pick it up and understand. So, you have these examples where people are trying to express cultural things in their life, right? It won't be a one-to-one ever direct translation. Point 4, learning English is different from acquiring English. So what we're doing right now is a mix of both, but in my previous videos, please subscribe, we're doing more learning English, right? I was giving rules and grammatical structures, and it's good to have them in your mind, right? Have an understanding of them, but it doesn't mean that you've acquired the language, right? Because I can pull out those words and structures naturally. I don't think about, all right, if it's past, present, and this, I don't think that way. It's just the language is mapped to my brain at this point because I'm a native speaker, and it just comes out correctly, right? My brain knows how to traverse the language and use it. Now that happens with time, right? With more time. The same in Spanish. I understand a lot of these grammatical structures in Spanish in a sense that I know when and when not to use them. But if you ask me to explain them, I have no idea because I only understood them by hearing people say them over and over again. So there's an important difference between consciously studying a language and naturally acquiring it. Studying grammar rules can help you understand how English works. And I studied English every native speaker. We have English class from elementary school, high school. We practice our own language. So you have to study it as well, right? It's not just about listening to people speak, but you need to listen to people speak as well. Over time, the combination of studying it and listening to people speak, these grammatical structures will come to feel automatic. But you need time. Your brain needs to marinate in them, right? These automatic feelings develop through repeated exposure. You hear the same patterns again and again and again until your brain recognizes them without consciously needing to analyze them. It becomes second nature. Point 5, anxiety makes translation worse. When you are nervous, perfectionist, or afraid of making mistakes, your brain becomes more cautious. You start checking every sentence. Is this verb correct? Did I use this right tense? Does this sound natural? The internal editing process slows you down. The more relaxed you become about making mistakes, the easier spontaneous English becomes. And you'll notice a lot of people, like me included, when I'm drinking a little bit, my Spanish flows better. There's points where I'm like, holy shit, I'm a native, And then other times where I'm like, I can't get a word out. All of it's related to how calm I am in my mental state. So it's an important point. All right, so now we're moving into phase 2, input and vocabulary. Choosing English you can mostly understand. So one of the best ways to reduce translation is to listen to English that is challenging but still understandable. A good target is around 80% comprehension, right? You should understand the general message without needing to stop constantly. If material is too difficult, your brain may depend on translation just to survive. But if it's too easy, you're not learning too much. Best material is slightly above your current level. And think about this, right? If you're understanding 80% of it, then the other 20, it gives your brain a lot of room to really start to process the other 20 and try to decipher it. And think about how do babies learn? They're just hit with the language over and over again until the baby understands one word, then 2 words, then a sentence, then 5 sentences. And the amount the brain starts to understand it just keeps growing and growing, that now it can dive into more complex ideas and more complex structures, right? The brain is a thinking, learning computer, but it just needs examples and repetition over time, in addition to studying like what we're doing now. Point 7, learn phrases instead of individual words. Instead of memorizing appointment equals translation, right? You learn I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow instead of learning decision. Learn I haven't made a decision yet, right? We need to put the words into context because words are used as ideas, but no one expresses an idea just as one word, right? They're always chains of ideas linked together because generally speaking, the idea that you're trying to express is complex. So it requires chains of words that manipulate one word or another to start forming the exact idea that you want to say. So it's basically patterns over time. And most people never have any novel ideas. No, but it's true, right? You're not going to invent any new words in English. So any idea that you've had has been said before, and there is a elegant right way to express it. You just need to learn that way. And the best way to learn that way is to see another English speaker say it. So example in my own Spanish is I cannot really state an idea very eloquently that I haven't heard someone else say before. But ideas that I've heard other people traverse a million times, when I need to say those same ideas, I can whip it out, and it sounds beautiful. So your brain starts learning English as complete patterns. These patterns are much easier to retrieve during real conversation. So it's important to learn words in the context of patterns. Point 8, start using an English dictionary. So this is actually very true. Once your English reaches an intermediate level, ditch the translation. We want to move away from translating, and we want English to separate from your Spanish or from whatever else and to exist on its own and start becoming its own thinking thing, right? So you want to try using English dictionaries to read the translations in the native language, right? Exhausted, you might read extremely tired. So now you're connecting English to English. And so you're moving away from the translation and it's just existing on its own. This helps your brain stay inside the language. Point 9, do not depend too much on flashcards. Flashcards are important at the A1, A2 level, right? To build up the core initial vocabulary. You need that. You need that base. From the base, you can move up. But there's a problem if every flashcard looks English word to native translation. Like that's very important in the beginning, but we must move eventually away from that because you accidentally train yourself to translate. So a better approach is meeting the same word many times in different sentences, conversations, and stories. When you see the same word over and over again in multiple conversations, it's like repetition for the brain, and the brain gets this really clear picture about what the word means in so many different scenarios that it just kind of embeds it into the brain long term. Point 10, super important. Pay attention. Become comfortable with ambiguity. Any language learner understands you do not need to understand every word. This is one of the biggest changes that intermediate learners need to make. Imagine you understand 80% of a conversation. That may already be enough to understand the main idea. Instead of stopping every time you hear an unfamiliar word, keep listening. Context will often explain the missing information. Fluent listening requires being comfortable with partial understanding. And like learning a language is like weightlifting for a brain. And the time your brain spends trying to process this ambiguity, it becomes smarter. It's like it's weightlifting because in your native tongue, it's very rare to come across words that you don't understand, especially if you're a reader. And so it's like when I actually come across words in English that I have never seen before, I'm like, oh wow, that's like it's a big day for me, you know. But in Spanish, that's all the time, right? So you have to kind of grow in ambiguity, being comfortable in ambiguity, and I think that trains you to be a more intelligent person, and also a more, I would say, confident person, right? Like if there's an ambiguous moment, you know, you're not freaking out. You're just calmly sitting there and you're like the understanding will reveal itself in time as I continue to calmly listen. Phase 3, very important. Training your brain to use English directly. So talk to yourself in English would be point 11. One of the easiest ways to practice thinking in English is through simple internal monologues. You can narrate your day. I'm making coffee. I need to go to the supermarket. It's really hot today. I don't feel like working right now. These thoughts do not need to be complicated. The goal is to make producing English feel normal. Your internal monologue is generally in your native tongue, right? Like when I've spent weekends in just pure isolated, Spanish groups that everyone's speaking Spanish. I'm like the only native English speaker. The monologue eventually switches to what they're saying because I'm only getting hit with Spanish all the time, right? You can kind of try to do this on your own. And I tend to do this sometimes too when I'm like listening to a Spanish podcast and I pause it and I'm like pissed about something and I just start articulating this idea in Spanish, mainly to show off to myself that I'm like, damn, like I'm a pretty good speaker at this point, right? After years of practicing. All right, moving on. Point 12. Connect words to images and emotions, right? When you hear the word apple, try to imagine an apple. Do not imagine the translation of the word. When you hear angry, think about the feeling of anger, right? When you hear running, picture someone running. This builds direct connections between English and real concepts. That's why when you learn English in the context of a movie or a series and you see that emotion displayed, the point of language is to explain ideas, emotions, problems, life, love. So it embeds in the brain in a much, much deeper way than if you were just to read the translation. That's the point here. Number 13, using shadowing. Shadowing means listening to someone speak English and repeating the words almost immediately. So this is important because active repetition is a different thing than passive listening, right? It trains the brain to produce it, and producing it requires you to recall it, what you would do if you're listening, and then it requires the skill with the tongue and everything to mold the language and create it. And so this does something to the brain that we don't fully understand, but it is quite important, right? So you follow the speaker. Speaker says, "I've been working here for about 3 years." You repeat it immediately. Because you have to keep up with the speaker, you don't have much time to translate, and you're building that skill to produce it. Same could be said, there's been studies shown that when you write something down, it let's say you're trying to learn anything, right? And if you write it down versus type it or just versus passively read, the act of writing it down kind of carves it into your brain as well as into the paper. And there's been studies shown that you learn better that way. And it's kind of tiring, right? I don't really write anymore, but lately I've been writing to practice. And I'm like, wow, like this is exhausting. My hand hurts, but it requires intense mental focus to craft the letters onto the page. And so you're crafting the letters, you're focusing on the meaning, right? It's another example of like weightlifting for the brain. Point 14, train your ear for real spoken English. So English in textbooks often sounds very different from English in real conversations. Native speakers connect words. They reduce sounds. They sometimes speak very quickly. We see this a lot in French, right? So, like, it's like what the French that you learn in the textbook is completely different than the spoken French in the street. Same thing could be said for Spanish, right? So, if you only study carefully pronounced English, natural speech may feel like a completely different language. And to a degree, it is, right? It's reduced, it's natives talking amongst natives, right? They have their own way. And then we have the formal way that we teach each other, so we're all on the same page. But at the street level, it becomes very different. So listening to real spoken English helps your brain recognize these patterns automatically. And it's a real demonstration of fluency, right? It's the truest demonstration of fluency. Point 15, learn grammar through context. Grammar is useful, but when you are having a conversation, you do not want to think, okay, now I need the present perfect, then the past participle. Instead, you want phrases like I've never been there or I've already finished to sound simply correct. Repeated exposure helps grammar become intuitive. You begin recognizing patterns instead of constructing every sentence from a rule. And the goal is to become native-like. So in Spanish, in my own examples, I don't know a single rule and I just try to get out the idea, right? Solo estoy tratando de expresar mis ideas con un poquito de fluidez. No estoy siguiendo un pinche regla gramatical todo el tiempo, right? So it's like I'm not trying to express grammar rules or think through them. I'm just trying to get my idea out. And as a non-native speaker of Spanish, how I learn grammar is by seeing the natives say ideas that I understand, but I may not be able to understand how to structure them myself if I had to express the same idea. So once I see them structure the idea, I'm like, oh, that's how I understood what you said, but I never knew all the nuances of how to put these sounds in order in the way you're doing it, but now I can do it because I've seen you do it over and over again. So you recognize grammatical patterns over time through exposure. You still need to study them out of the jump, follow and subscribe because I go through them on previous things. But once you have the understanding and we did a little bit of studying, how you actually master it is listening to natives use it over and over again. Phase 4, point 16, long-term habits and mindset. So this is probably the most important point of any of the points, right? None of the other things work unless you have a long-term habits and mindset. So point 16 is build small daily habits. Language learning works better through consistency than occasional intense studying. So it's this idea, right? To master English, you need about, let's say, 10,000 hours would make you a god, a native level speaker, almost indistinguishable from a native, right? You would be fluent, maybe not native, but fluent. But to have a great level of English can be achieved at around 5,000 to 8,000 hours, where you go to the United States, you can have a girlfriend, a boyfriend, probably work most jobs, right? You're chilling. So to get to that 5,000, 8,000 hours is not really, it's not a sprint. It's a marathon. It takes time. So learning works better through consistency than occasional intense studying. 20 minutes of English every day is actually more useful than 3 hours once a week. You kind of want to just zap the brain with English daily, right? Just keep that muscle, train it a little bit, little shoulder press, and then over time, it slowly expands and expands. But there's this, it's kind of like a bonsai tree. For those of you guys that understand growing bonsai trees, the Japanese art, you can water this tree for 6 months, 7 months, and nothing. You won't think a thing is growing. English is the same way. Then one day, a stalk just shoots out, right? Because the root system and all the foundation is growing over time. And it's not something that you can sense, right? It's something that after a long period of time, when you look back, then you realize how far you've come and how much better you are from day one. But you can't really notice it in the moment. So that's where being disciplined and having small daily habits over long periods of time comes into play. Podcasts are especially useful because they introduce your brain to this routine. I want to do a one podcast here where we talk about random topics that are not boring. I was listening to some other intermediate English stuff. I'm like, Christ. And so follow and subscribe. Thank you. And we're going to make this into a routine. Point 17, treat mistakes as information. Mistakes are not proof that you are bad at English. Mistakes show that you have not mastered it yet. Every mistake gives you information. If you're terrified of making errors, you may mentally translate everything before speaking. That makes conversation harder. You have to accept that mistakes are part of becoming fluent. It's weird because we forget that all native speakers were terrible at English at one point, but it was only because they were children. And so we don't remember seeing them. But if you're around children who are learning English, who are, from English speaking families, they make mistakes all the time, right? So you have to go through that process as well. You're just doing it as an adult, so it's viewed as embarrassing. But you need to put that aside, right? It doesn't matter. Who cares? Just make the mistakes, but focus on getting the point across and understand that you're just a learner. And if someone shames you for it, brush it off. It doesn't matter. Like, it truly doesn't matter. You're not doing this for them or for anyone else, right? So don't don't care what other people think about this, because some people will treat you cruelly. Most will be so impressed that you speak, right? So impressed and applaud you for it. So focus on that, right? Focus on accepting that you're going to make mistakes and accepting that this is the only way forward and not caring. Don't care. Point 18, focus on the topic, not the language. This is one of the most powerful ideas. Listen to English about subjects you generally enjoy. History, finance, sports, psychology, travel, whatever, you name it. When you become interested in the subject, you stop thinking, I'm practicing English. You start thinking, this is interesting. This is where language acquisition becomes more natural. Point 19, Replace bad translation patterns with real English. So, literal translation can sometimes create unnatural English. Maybe a phrase works perfectly in your language, but sounds strange when you translate directly. If you repeat these translated structures for years, they become habits. The solution is more exposure to natural English and kind of a coach to a degree, right? You want to be consuming natural English, normal podcasts. I can recommend a bunch that I listen to myself. And then in addition, you need to do some studying, right? I had English class as a kid every day in high school, and we learned how to write proper sentences, how to, create essays and things like that, like how to do formal written English. I learned all the grammatical rules the same way that you'll need to do it. I didn't just acquire it that way. 20 and final. Let's close her down. Give yourself time. So we have this culture of immediate gratification, right? Thinking in English is not something you turn on like a switch. It develops after a huge amount of exposure. You hear common phrases hundreds of times, right? For me to remember the word pared, which is wall in Spanish, I probably forgot that word easily 100 times. My brain just would not take it. So you need common phrases hundreds of times. Then one day you realize you no longer translate them. You just simply understand. This happens slowly. It takes more time. Languages are complicated. But eventually your brain reaches a point where English becomes to feel automatic. This process takes not hundreds of hours, thousands of hours. And that is okay. So let's summarize. The goal is not to force yourself to stop translating. The goal is to create so much direct exposure and experience with English that translation becomes unnecessary. Listen to English you can understand. Learn phrases instead of isolated words. Talk to yourself like you're crazy. Use English definitions. Accept uncertainty. Make mistakes. And spend as much time as possible engaging with English that you genuinely enjoy. Thinking in English is not something you force. It's something your brain gradually learns to do. Thank you everyone for listening. Please like and subscribe. Have a great day.